In August 1972, during a NATO-connected military logistics exercise held in the Netherlands, a Polish Army colonel in uniform approached an American military officer and handed him a sealed envelope. According to Benjamin Weiser's 2004 account, A Secret Life, the most comprehensive reconstruction of the case, drawn from declassified CIA documents and from Weiser's own extensive interviews with the colonel himself, the envelope contained a handwritten letter. The letter identified its author as a senior officer on the Polish General Staff, with access to classified Warsaw Pact military planning documents at the highest level of sensitivity. It stated that he was acting voluntarily, without external pressure, without financial incentive, and it stated that what he had seen in those planning documents posed a danger not merely to NATO, but to the Polish people themselves. The colonel's name was Ryszard Kukliński. He was 42 years old. He had served in the Polish People's Army for more than 2 decades, had risen through the General Staff's Operational Planning Division to a position of genuine strategic authority, and had spent years working at the highest levels of Warsaw Pact military coordination. He was married, the father of 2 sons, and lived in a modest apartment in Warsaw. He had never formally studied in the West, had no known CIA contacts, and had given Polish internal security no prior indication that he harbored sympathies incompatible with the socialist state he served. When the American officer's chain of command assessed the letter, the initial response was cautious. Unrequested approaches from Eastern Bloc military officers were not uncommon, and many turned out to be provocation operations, deliberate fabrications by Soviet or Polish security services designed to embarrass Western intelligence agencies or map potential counterintelligence vulnerabilities. A colonel on the Polish General Staff approaching American personnel during a NATO exercise with an offer to share Warsaw Pact secrets might easily have been exactly that, a provocation, a test, a trap. The CIA had seen enough of both to know that distinguishing between a genuine source and a fabricated one required time, verification, and the willingness to move slowly even when the potential value of the offer was extraordinary. He was not. What Ryszard Kukliński had in his head, and what he would spend the next 9 years passing to American intelligence, through a network of dead drops, encrypted radio communications, and personal couriers, would eventually constitute what senior CIA officials later described as the most significant single penetration of Warsaw Pact military planning achieved by Western intelligence during the entire Cold War. The 9 years between that initial contact and the night he vanished from Warsaw represent one of the longest sustained clandestine intelligence operations run by any Western service inside the Soviet bloc, a period during which a single source, working alone and without the knowledge of his colleagues, his family, or his government, provided an adversary power with a detailed and continuously updated picture of the most secret military planning of the alliance he served. He would photograph and transmit approximately 35,000 pages of classified documents. He would reveal targeting plans that showed which Polish and Central European cities the Soviet Union expected to sacrifice in a first nuclear exchange. He would give the United States advance warning of Soviet preparations to invade Poland twice, first in 1980 and again in 1981. And in November 1981, weeks before the Polish Communist government declared martial law and crushed the Solidarity trade union movement, he would vanish from Warsaw in the middle of the night, along with his wife and his 2 sons, in one of the most carefully orchestrated intelligence exfiltration operations of the Cold War era. By then, he would have served the CIA for longer than most American intelligence officers maintain a single posting. He had done so in one of the most surveilled cities in the Eastern Bloc, under a communist government whose internal security apparatus, the Służba Bezpieczeństwa, known as the SB, employed tens of thousands of full-time officers and an estimated network of civilian informants that reached into nearly every workplace, apartment building, and social organization in the country. He had done so while serving in the very institution those security services were designed to protect, and he had done so, by all available evidence, without ever being caught by the people who employed him. If the documented truth behind Cold War intelligence operations is something you want more of, one case, one family, one operation told in full, subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover these cases every week. What drove a decorated Polish general staff colonel to approach American personnel in the Netherlands and offer everything he knew about his country's most classified military planning was not a simple or single thing. To understand it requires understanding who Ryszard Kukliński was before 1972, where he had come from, what he had seen, and what he had come to believe about the country that claimed to speak in the name of the Polish people. Ryszard Kukliński was born on June 23, 1930, in the Wola district of Warsaw, a working-class neighborhood of narrow streets and tenement buildings in the western part of the Polish capital. His father, Władysław Kukliński, worked in one of Warsaw's many small trades that sustained the city's laboring districts in the interwar years. The family lived modestly, as most Warsaw families did during that period. Ryszard was 9 years old when Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, and 11 when the German occupation of Warsaw entered its most brutal phase. His father did not survive the war. According to family accounts compiled by researchers after Ryszard's eventual defection, Władysław Kukliński was arrested by German occupation authorities and killed during the period of systematic mass reprisals the German administration carried out against the Polish civilian population. Ryszard was a child when this happened, old enough to understand what had occurred, young enough that the absence of a father became simply a condition of his adolescence, as it was for hundreds of thousands of Polish children who grew up in the rubble of the German occupation and the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. Warsaw itself was largely destroyed by the time the war ended in 1945. The German military had systematically leveled the city following the failed uprising, reducing block after block to rubble in a deliberate act of destruction that killed an estimated 200,000 people and left the physical fabric of the capital in ruins. The Warsaw, into which the Soviet-backed Polish Provisional Government stepped in 1945, was a city of burned-out shells, collapsed facades, and displaced survivors, picking through the wreckage of what had been one of Central Europe's major metropolitan centers. Kukliński was 15 when the war ended. He was of the generation that would form the backbone of the new Polish People's Army, young men who had grown up in occupation and destruction and who came of age in a Poland that had been, in the assessment of its new Soviet-aligned government, liberated by the Red Army. Whether that was liberation or a different kind of occupation was a question the new government did not permit to be asked publicly. Kukliński joined the Polish military and proved himself capable and committed. He advanced through the ranks steadily, graduating from military academy, receiving early promotions, developing specializations in operational planning that made him valuable to commanders looking for staff officers who could process complex logistics and strategy. His personal conduct was without significant disciplinary incident. His Communist Party membership was maintained without apparent conflict. He married a woman named Hanna, called Hanka by family and close colleagues, with whom he would eventually have 2 sons, Bogdan and Waldemar. The family lived in Warsaw in military-issued housing, with the particular privileges and particular constraints that came with serving as an officer in the People's Army of a Soviet bloc state. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Kukliński had reached a level of seniority that placed him in the operational planning apparatus of the Polish General Staff. This was the division responsible for coordinating Poland's participation in Warsaw Pact military planning, the Soviet-led military alliance through which the Soviet Union organized the armed forces of its Eastern European satellite states into an integrated command structure theoretically capable of prosecuting a major war against NATO. Kukliński's work brought him into direct contact with Soviet military planners at the highest levels of Warsaw Pact coordination. He attended meetings and Warsaw Pact planning conferences across Eastern Europe, in Moscow, Budapest, and East Berlin. He reviewed planning documents and participated in joint exercises. He was fluent in the technical vocabulary of modern military planning, comfortable in the company of Soviet generals, and trusted by both Polish and Soviet superiors, with access to materials that relatively few officers on either side of the Iron Curtain ever saw. What he saw in those materials, according to his later accounts to CIA debriefers and to testimony he gave journalists and researchers in the years after his defection, disturbed him in ways that accumulated gradually over the course of several years. The Warsaw Pact's military planning for a potential war with NATO was not, from a Polish perspective, simply a set of contingencies for defending socialist Poland against Western aggression. It was a calculus in which Poland itself was a geographic fact to be exploited and, if necessary, expended. Soviet war plans, which Kukliński reviewed in his capacity as a senior Polish planning officer, allocated Poland's territory as a staging ground for a westward armored offensive. They positioned Polish cities and transportation networks as logistical assets, and in the nuclear dimension of the planning, they identified Polish territory as an expected zone of early nuclear use, including by Soviet forces themselves, in a conflict scenario in which the Soviet Union prioritized defeating NATO military assets in Central Europe, regardless of the destruction to the Polish homeland those nuclear strikes would cause. There is no single document and no single conversation that Kukliński ever cited as the moment his understanding of this calculus crystallized into a decision to act. What he described, in debriefings and interviews, was a slow accumulation of information that produced a conclusion he found impossible to rationalize away, that the Soviet Union's planning treated Poland not as an ally but as a theater, a piece of geography that was useful alive and acceptable destroyed. The Polish people in the Soviet war plans Kukliński reviewed were not the subject of the plan's protections. They were, in a meaningful sense, a variable within it. He said, in a later interview with Polish émigré journalists, that he thought often in those years about his father, about a man killed by one foreign occupying power in a country that had now exchanged one occupation for another. He did not use that language publicly while he was still in Poland. He could not. But it was, by his own later account, present in his thinking as he rode the Warsaw Metro to work each morning, as he reviewed Soviet planning cables in his office in the General Staff Building, and as he eventually formed the conclusion that the only meaningful act of service to his country was to ensure that someone outside the Warsaw Pact knew what was inside those plans. The initial contact in the Netherlands in August 1972 was followed by a period of careful, cautious CIA assessment. The agency moved slowly and methodically, wary of a provocation operation, but aware that, if the colonel's approach was genuine, the potential intelligence value was extraordinary. According to Weiser's account, the CIA's initial vetting of Kukliński included multiple verification steps: cross-checking his identity against available records, assessing the plausibility of his claimed access, and evaluating the consistency of his stated motivations over a series of subsequent contacts. Kukliński's first substantive intelligence exchange with the CIA took place later in 1972 through a channel that the agency established carefully, building in multiple layers of security to protect both the operation and the source. The mechanics of what would become a 9-year relationship were established over the course of those early exchanges. Kukliński would photograph classified documents using a Minox subminiature camera, a device barely longer than a thumb, and designed specifically for clandestine document photography, small enough to disappear into a jacket pocket and produce no discernible outline against the fabric. He would leave exposed film cartridges at dead-drop locations in and around Warsaw, concealed in precisely specified spots, marked by prearranged signals that a CIA officer working under diplomatic cover at the American Embassy in Warsaw would check according to an established schedule. The CIA officer would collect the film, replace it with fresh cartridges, and, when appropriate, with material to pass back to Kukliński, instructions, communication schedules, and occasionally cash. The two sides communicated additionally through a shortwave radio receiver that Kukliński kept concealed in his Warsaw apartment, through which the CIA transmitted encoded messages on a schedule that both parties maintained. The physical act of photographing documents in the General Staff Building was not simple. Kukliński worked in a building with controlled access and colleagues who moved through the same corridors and offices throughout the day. He developed a routine that allowed him to work alone with sensitive materials during the quieter hours, sometimes before colleagues arrived in the morning, sometimes in the evenings after most of the staff had left. He photographed documents one page at a time, holding the Minox at the precise measured distance required for adequate focus on the text, working quickly and methodically, replacing documents in their folders, securing the exposed cartridge. The cartridges were small enough to be concealed in ordinary objects, inside a pen, a tube of adhesive, a container that could pass unnoticed in a briefcase or coat pocket on the walk out of the building. The dead drop locations were chosen by the CIA and communicated to Kukliński through the radio channel or through personal contact during his periodic official visits to the West. A dead drop was a specific fixed point in the physical landscape of Warsaw, a crevice in a particular wall, a hollow beneath a specific park bench, a precise position under a bridge, where material could be concealed and retrieved without either party needing to share the same space at the same time. Kukliński would place the loaded film at the designated location and mark the drop as active through a prearranged signal. The CIA officer would check that signal, collect the material if indicated, replace it with fresh film or instructions, and mark the location as cleared. The exchange happened without either party ever needing to speak to the other, acknowledge the other's existence, or share the same physical space in a way that could be observed by the SB surveillance apparatus that monitored diplomatic personnel and their movements throughout the city. The CIA gave him the operational codename Jack Strong, a name Kukliński himself reportedly suggested, taken from an American Western hero whose name he had encountered in a translated novel. The name suited neither the careful, methodical man who had chosen it, nor the careful, methodical nature of the operation, but it remained with him for the 9 years of the relationship and became, in the accounts that eventually emerged, the shorthand by which his intelligence work was most widely known. One of Kukliński's primary CIA handlers during the early years of the operation was David Forden, an agency officer who later described the experience of reviewing Kukliński's initial transmissions, as detailed in Weiser's account, as unlike anything in his professional career. The documents were genuine, verified through multiple independent channels. They reflected real planning and real Soviet military thinking, and they answered questions that American military planners had been attempting to answer for years without resolution. From late 1972 onward, Kukliński photographed and passed to the CIA the most sensitive strategic military planning documents maintained by the Warsaw Pact's command structure. These included operational war plans for a conflict with NATO, both the broad strategic outlines and the specific operational annexes detailing movement schedules, logistics requirements, command structures, and nuclear employment guidelines. They included Soviet assessments of Western military capabilities. They included the technical specifications of Soviet military equipment deployed across Warsaw Pact states, and they included materials that Western intelligence analysts had never seen, documents that confirmed, specified, or directly contradicted assessments that the CIA and the Pentagon had worked with for years. The intelligence value was in the assessment of senior CIA officials who reviewed the material almost without precedent in the Cold War era. By the time the operation concluded in 1981, Kukliński had transmitted approximately 35,000 pages of original Warsaw Pact documents, a volume of material that, combined with the analytical assessments it generated, constituted one of the most extensive single-source intelligence collections of the Cold War. His contributions helped American military planners revise their understanding of Soviet doctrine, their assessment of Warsaw Pact capabilities, and their evaluation of the strategic balance in Central Europe. The specific nature of those contributions remained classified for decades. What senior CIA officials and Pentagon analysts did say in the years after Kukliński's defection and in the academic and journalistic accounts that eventually emerged was that the intelligence he provided had materially affected American defense planning in ways that retained strategic significance long after the documents themselves became obsolete. The years between 1972 and 1980 were, in the external view of the Kukliński family, entirely unremarkable. Ryszard continued to rise in the Polish military hierarchy. He was decorated with military honors. He continued to be trusted with access to sensitive planning materials, trusted in the way that the Polish military system trusted officers who had demonstrated loyalty, competence, and ideological reliability over many years. His wife Hanka managed the household. Bogdan and Waldemar grew into young men. The family took vacations when circumstances permitted, and Kukliński developed a well-known personal enthusiasm for sailing, which he pursued during official travel that occasionally brought him to Western ports. The CIA officers who managed his case during this period maintained contact with extreme care, aware that a single error in operational security could expose the entire network and end Kukliński's life. His handlers rotated according to the normal posting cycles of diplomatic officers at the American Embassy in Warsaw, and each transition required re-establishing the protocols and personal trust that made clandestine communication possible. There was always the possibility that any given dead drop check would coincide with a Polish or Soviet counterintelligence surveillance operation targeting embassy personnel. There was always the possibility that a neighbor had noticed something, that a colleague had mentioned something to an SB officer, that a routine security review of document access had turned up something anomalous. None of these things happened. For 8 years, the operation continued without apparent compromise. The sustained nature of the operation, 9 years of regular dead drop cycles, shortwave radio schedules, and document photography, placed demands on Kukliński that went beyond the immediate physical risk of any given exchange. It required him to be, simultaneously and without interruption, 2 different people: the trusted senior officer who attended Warsaw Pact planning conferences and received military decorations and discussed strategic problems with Soviet generals, and the man who photographed those same planning documents and passed them to an adversary service. The 2 versions of himself had to coexist without any visible seam in every professional and personal interaction for nearly a decade. Colleagues who worked alongside him in the General Staff Building during those years later described him, in accounts compiled after his defection became public, as serious, professional, and reliable, a man who carried significant responsibility without apparent strain. The strain, to whatever extent it existed, was not visible. That was the requirement, and by all available evidence, he met it for 9 consecutive years. The operation also created periodic opportunities for face-to-face contact between Kukliński and his CIA handlers during his official visits to the West, moments that served purposes the dead drop system could not. Physical meetings allowed the CIA to assess his psychological state, to discuss operational security concerns that were too complex to encode for radio transmission, to provide updated equipment, and to conduct the relationship maintenance that sustains a clandestine intelligence partnership over the long term. According to Weiser's account, these meetings were also, for Kukliński, a kind of compressed expression of the alternative life he had chosen, a few hours in which the surface he maintained in Warsaw could be set aside, and the actual terms of his situation acknowledged plainly by both parties. In Washington, the material he provided was being integrated into American military planning at the highest levels of sensitivity. The war plans he had photographed allowed Pentagon and NATO planners to calibrate their understanding of Warsaw Pact intentions with a specificity that had not previously been achievable. Certain assumptions about Soviet military doctrine that had shaped American force planning were revised in light of what his documents showed, the specific nature of those adjustments, which elements of American or NATO planning were modified, and in which direction remained classified and has not been fully disclosed. What senior officials who had access to the material said in the years after the Cold War ended was that it had been used and that it had mattered. The political crisis that began to transform Poland in the summer of 1980 gave Kukliński's work a new and immediately urgent dimension. The emergence of Solidarność, the Solidarity trade union movement that grew from strikes at the Gdansk shipyards in August 1980, represented a challenge to the communist system unlike anything the Eastern Bloc had faced since the Prague Spring of 1968. Within weeks of the Gdansk agreements that legalized solidarity, in late August 1980, the movement had enrolled hundreds of thousands of members. Within months, Its membership was estimated at 9 million Poles, roughly a third of the country's adult population. Its leader, a shipyard electrician named Lech Wałęsa, had become an internationally recognized figure whose negotiating position carried the implicit backing of a workforce capable of shutting down the Polish economy. The Soviet response to this development was shaped from the beginning by the memory of 1968, when Warsaw Pact forces had invaded Czechoslovakia to suppress the reformist Prague Spring. Soviet leaders watched the Polish situation escalate with increasing alarm throughout the autumn of 1980, and their internal communications, which the CIA was monitoring through multiple channels, reflected a growing assessment that the Polish state might be unable to suppress solidarity through its own means, and that Soviet military intervention might become necessary. In the autumn and winter of 1980, the military and logistical preparations that would precede any such intervention were already underway. Soviet forces conducted exercises along the Polish border. Warsaw Pact communications traffic increased significantly. In the General Staff Building in Warsaw, Kukliński was reviewing documents that described not hypothetical contingency planning, but active operational preparation, troop movement schedules, logistics requirements, command arrangements for a military force that would enter Poland if the Polish state's institutions failed to restore what Moscow defined as order. He photographed these documents with the same methodical care he had applied to everything else over the preceding 8 years, and he passed them through his dead drop network with what was, given the circumstances, remarkable composure. The CIA's Warsaw Station officers who collected those materials and transmitted them to Langley were receiving in real time a window into Soviet decision-making at one of the most dangerous moments in Cold War history, a moment when Soviet military intervention in Central Europe was a genuine possibility rather than a theoretical contingency. The intelligence Kukliński provided during this period gave the United States government advance warning of Soviet military preparations that might otherwise have remained obscured until an intervention was already in motion. The United States used this intelligence carefully, communicating to Soviet leadership through multiple diplomatic channels that an invasion of Poland would carry severe consequences for superpower relations, consequences that went beyond the diplomatic costs of the 1968 Czechoslovakia intervention. Whether these signals contributed to the Soviet decision not to intervene directly, or whether the eventual imposition of martial law by General Wojciech Jaruzelski was itself seen by Moscow as an acceptable Polish solution to the Polish problem, remains a subject of historical debate. What is less debated is that the intelligence Kukliński provided during this period was among the most operationally significant material he passed in his entire 9-year relationship with the CIA. Through 1981, the political situation in Poland continued to deteriorate from the communist government's perspective. Soviet pressure on the Jaruzelski government to take decisive action was, as Kukliński could see from the planning documents that crossed his desk, becoming increasingly explicit. By autumn of 1981, Kukliński was reviewing materials that detailed the Polish military's planning for a domestic declaration of martial law, a plan that would involve mass arrests of Solidarity leadership, the deployment of military and police forces across the country, and the suspension of the civil liberties that had been the movement's foundation. He passed this information too. In doing so, he gave the CIA advance warning that the crackdown was coming, warning that American officials communicated in general terms to Solidarity's leadership through various intermediaries. When martial law was eventually declared on December 13, 1981, many of Solidarity's leaders were arrested in the first hours of the operation, suggesting that whatever warning they had received had not translated into effective evasion. But Ryszard Kukliński was not in Poland to see it. By December 13th, he had been gone from Warsaw for more than 5 weeks. The decision to extract Kukliński and his family was not made in a vacuum of information. According to Weiser's account, the CIA received information in late October or early November of 1981 indicating that Polish counterintelligence had developed material that pointed, at least indirectly, toward a penetration in the General Staff's planning division. The precise nature of this counterintelligence break, whether it came from a Soviet tip, from surveillance of CIA officers in Warsaw, from anomalies in document access logs, or from some other source, was never definitively established in accounts that became public. What the CIA's Warsaw station determined was that the risk to Kukliński had crossed a threshold requiring immediate action. The message reached Kukliński in the first days of November 1981 through the shortwave radio channel the CIA had used throughout their relationship. Encoded in the system he had been trained on and had used for 9 years, its meaning was unambiguous. The operation was being terminated, his security had been compromised, and he needed to prepare to leave Poland within days. He could not tell Hanka and his sons the full circumstances immediately. The departure needed to appear, for the days that preceded it, consistent with the family's ordinary routine. Any detectable change in behavior could trigger the SB surveillance that monitored the apartments and daily movements of senior military officers. Hanka Kukliński would later describe this period as one of concentrated tension she understood only partially in real time. Her husband had told her they needed to leave Poland. He had told her it was serious and that there was no time to explain everything. She had begun preparing in the quiet, careful way of a person who understands the direction without yet knowing the full destination. What the family could take with them was limited to what could fit in a vehicle without drawing attention. The Warsaw apartment they had lived in for years, the furniture Hanka had chosen, the kitchen she had cooked in for 2 decades, the photographs of the boys' childhoods that hung on the walls, the books, the accumulated objects of a family life, built over many years in the same rooms, was left exactly as it was. They could not pack in a way that suggested permanent departure. They could not make telephone calls that would later be reviewed. They could not say goodbye to anyone. Colleagues, neighbors, and friends would notice nothing until the morning Kukliński failed to appear for duty, at which point the apartment would still look to anyone who eventually entered it like the home of a family that had stepped out briefly and expected to return. The exfiltration was conducted on the night of November 7th into the early hours of November 8th, 1981. The precise operational details of how Kukliński, Hanka, Bogdan, and Waldemar were moved out of Warsaw, through East German territory and across into West Germany have not been fully disclosed in public accounts, and some elements remain classified. What has been established from accounts that emerged over time is that the family traveled by road, that the operation required advanced positioning of CIAO assets and coordination with at least one Allied intelligence service, and that it was completed within a single night, a crossing through one of the most monitored corridors in the world, conducted without incident. The family arrived in West Germany in the early hours of November 8th, 1981, and was received by CIA officers who had been positioned in advance. The days that immediately followed were spent in CIA safe-house locations, while the agency conducted initial security assessments and arranged the logistics of moving the family onward to the United States. It was in those first days, in the particular suspended quality of the immediate aftermath of an exfiltration, when the immediate danger has passed but the new life has not yet begun, that Hanka Kukliński learned, in full, what her husband had been doing for 9 years. The conversations that took place during that period were not recorded in any account that became public. What can be said is that by the time the family reached the United States, Hanka Kukliński understood the complete picture of her husband's double life and the reasons he had built it. What she did with that understanding, how she processed the revelation that the man she had lived beside for 2 decades had been operating a clandestine relationship with a foreign intelligence service throughout the entirety of their Warsaw years, is not something the available record captures. What the record does capture is that she stayed, and that the two of them built the subsequent decades of American exile together, and that she was with him when he died in 2004. In the Polish capital they left behind, the first administrative notice of Kukliński's absence came through routine channels. He had not reported for duty on the morning of November 8th. By November 9th, the Polish military was processing an unexplained absence for a senior general staff officer. When the initial inquiry reached the SB, and the SB's investigation reached the conclusion that Kukliński had fled the country with his family. The family was already in the United States. The scope of what he had known, and therefore of what he had almost certainly passed to a foreign intelligence service over an extended period, became clear to Polish and Soviet counterintelligence as they worked through the access logs and the materials he had handled in his 9 years on the general staff. The plans would require review, assessment, and in some cases fundamental revision. The breach covered nearly a decade of the most sensitive Warsaw Pact military planning. The Polish military formally charged Ryszard Kukliński with treason and desertion in 1982. The charges were tried in his absence by a military tribunal whose proceedings were closed to the public and from which no defense was possible, given that the defendant was beyond Polish jurisdiction and living under an assumed identity in the United States. In 1984, after proceedings that reflected the gravity with which the communist state viewed the case, the tribunal returned a verdict of guilty on all charges. The sentence imposed was death by firing squad. An additional penalty of permanent forfeiture of military rank and all associated state benefits was included in the judgment. The verdict was communicated to Polish media and became public knowledge, the first time that many Poles had heard the name Ryszard Kukliński. The official framing was unambiguous. He was a traitor who had violated his oath of service and provided information damaging to Polish national security to an adversary power. What that official framing could not and did not acknowledge was the content of what Kukliński had revealed, that Polish national security, as defined by Soviet war planners in the documents he had photographed, included the planned nuclear targeting of Polish cities in a war whose objectives were defined in Moscow. In the United States, the CIA settled Kukliński and his family under new identities at an undisclosed location. He underwent extensive debriefing sessions with agency analysts throughout 1982 and into 1983, working through his recollections of everything he had seen, everything he had reported, and everything that had not been captured in the microfilm that passed through his dead drops over 9 years. These sessions were classified, and their specific contents were never disclosed. The family, Kukliński, Hanka, Bogdan, and Waldemar, began building American lives under names that were not their own, in a country whose language they were learning and whose customs they were adapting to, without the ability to be honest with any person outside a small CIA circle about who they were and what had brought them there. When the news reached Kukliński in 1984 that the Polish military tribunal had sentenced him to death, he was living in the United States under an assumed name, as CIA analysts continued to work through the full intelligence legacy the 9-year operation had generated. The sentence was not unexpected. He had known from the moment of the exfiltration that the Polish state would pursue the most severe available penalty, but its formal pronouncement carried its own weight. He could not discuss it publicly. He could not respond to it. The death sentence existed in Polish legal records as a fact about a man named Ryszard Kukliński, and he was living as someone else in a country that knew who he was but could not acknowledge it. The particular texture of that situation, condemned to death by the country of your birth, celebrated in secret by the country of your exile, unable to speak openly about either, was one that no available account fully captures. Hanka Kukliński gave accounts of this period in later years that reflected, with notable precision, the particular texture of displacement that resists summary. She described learning English in a country where she had no history, no neighborhood she had grown up in, no school she had walked past as a child, no church where her family had attended weddings and funerals over decades. She described the disorientation of navigating American daily life where everything was, by any material measure, more available than it had been in Poland, and where she nonetheless felt the constant low-level strangeness of someone who does not know the right name for the thing she is looking for, who cannot fully explain who she is or where she comes from, who must maintain a surface of ordinary American neighborliness while carrying a history that the surface cannot contain. She described missing Warsaw in ways that surprised her with their specificity. Not the Warsaw of politics or ideology, or the communist state she had left behind, but the Warsaw of physical memory, the quality of autumn light on certain streets, the particular sound of the tram system, the rhythm of a city she had inhabited for her entire adult life. Exile, she said in one account, is not simply being somewhere new. It is being somewhere your past does not exist, where the accumulated texture of your life, the faces and streets and language that make you legible to yourself, are absent, and you must construct a new version of yourself from the available materials of a country that does not know you and cannot know you. She had built that new version. She had done it for more than 2 decades, but the original version remained, and the distance between them was something she did not expect to cross. The sons faced the particular challenge of identity displacement that comes to young people who are old enough to have formed themselves in one country and are then required to become someone else in another. In America, they navigated the ordinary textures of young adult life while carrying a history that was not available to anyone they encountered. Every new acquaintance was a negotiation of how much to reveal and how to explain the accent and what to say when someone asked where they were from. The answer had to be consistent with the assumed identity the family was using, which meant that the truth of who they were and what their father had done was available only within a very small circle. Both sons appear, from the limited accounts that exist, to have managed this with the pragmatic competence that most people bring to necessity. They built lives. They got on with the business of being alive. But the constraint was constant, and it did not lift. In 1994, one of Kukliński's sons died in a boating accident somewhere in the United States. He was in his mid-30s. The following year, 1995, his second son was struck and killed by a vehicle while on foot. The driver did not stop and was never identified. American investigators who reviewed both cases did not reach conclusions pointing definitively toward deliberate action, but in the years that followed, members of the family and researchers who examined the circumstances raised questions that could not be definitively answered. The Soviet Union had dissolved in 1991, but its successor intelligence services retained institutional knowledge of individuals who had caused serious damage to Soviet operations, and a documented historical pattern of delayed institutional retribution against such individuals existed. Whether the deaths of both sons within less than 12 months of each other represented that pattern, or whether they were what the physical evidence showed, 2 separate accidents, was a question that remained open and was never resolved. Kukliński, by the time his sons were gone, was in his mid-60s. He had spent more than a decade living under an assumed identity. He had given extensive service to an operation that his adopted country regarded as one of the defining intelligence successes of the Cold War. He had watched the world he had risked his life to inform, the world of Soviet military hegemony over Central Europe, of nuclear targeting lists that included the cities of the country he was trying to protect, dissolve with remarkable speed after 1989. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The Warsaw Pact had disbanded. The Soviet Union itself had ceased to exist. The documents he had photographed at such risk were now artifacts of a strategic environment that no longer existed, and he had lost both of his sons. The transformation of Poland after 1989 created the conditions for a public reassessment of Kukliński's case, a reassessment that turned out to be one of the most contested and revealing debates in post-communist Polish public life. On one side were those who argued that Kukliński had been a traitor, a man who had violated his oath as a Polish officer, had provided classified information to a foreign power without authorization, and had done so in a way that was, whatever his motivations, legally and ethically indefensible. This position was held not only by former communist officials, but by some Polish legal scholars and military professionals who believed that the integrity of the military oath required accountability to proper authority, not to individual officers making private assessments of the national interest. They argued that if every senior officer who disagreed with government policy was entitled to pass classified documents to an adversary power based on personal conviction, no military institution could function and no classified information could remain secure. The principle at stake was not whether Kukliński's assessment of Soviet intentions had been accurate. It was whether individual officers could appoint themselves the arbiters of their country's true interests and act accordingly, without authorization, against the institutions they served. On the other side were those who argued that Kukliński had been, in the fullest sense, a Polish patriot, a man who had recognized that the Warsaw Pact was not a voluntary alliance among equal partners, but a Soviet-dominated structure in which Poland's territory, population, and sovereignty were subordinated to Soviet strategic interests, and who had acted to expose that reality to those best positioned to use the information constructively. This position held that the oath Kukliński had sworn was an oath to Poland, not to the communist government that administered Poland, and that acting in Poland's genuine national interest required acting against a government that served Soviet interests rather than Polish ones. This argument had the advantage of being consistent with what the documents Kukliński had passed actually showed, that Soviet war planning contemplated nuclear use on Polish territory, that Polish cities were identified in those plans as acceptable casualties in a war whose objectives were defined in Moscow, and that the Polish Communist government had been a participant in, rather than a critic of, that planning. The Polish Supreme Court addressed the legal dimension of this debate in 1995, reviewing the 1984 tribunal's verdict and overturning the conviction on the grounds that the original proceedings had been conducted in violation of Polish law, and that the acts for which Kukliński had been convicted could not, under a proper legal analysis applicable to the post-communist Polish state, be considered criminal. The court's reasoning engaged carefully with the distinction between loyalty to the Polish state as it existed under communist governance and loyalty to the Polish people's genuine national interests, a distinction the communist-era tribunal had, by its nature, been unable to make. The ruling ended the legal jeopardy under which Kukliński had lived for more than a decade. It did not end the public argument about what he had done. The 2 years between the Supreme Court ruling in 1995 and his eventual return to Poland in 1997 were years in which Kukliński existed in Polish public life as a figure without a fixed identity, legally rehabilitated but personally absent, honored in some quarters and condemned in others, the subject of a debate that was conducted in his name but without his participation. Polish newspapers carried editorials about him. Veterans organizations issued statements. Former communist officials gave interviews about the damage his espionage had done to Polish national security. Former Solidarity activists gave interviews about the advance warnings he had provided. He followed this debate from the United States, from his undisclosed location, with the attention of a man who is being discussed by people who do not know where he is. He had lived with this condition, the condition of being a public figure who cannot publicly be himself, since 1981. By 1997, it had been the defining condition of his adult life for 16 years. In April 1987, 15 and a half years after leaving Warsaw in the middle of the night, Ryszard Kukliński returned to Poland for the first time. He was 66 years old. He arrived at Warsaw's Okęcie airport to a reception that reflected the genuine complexity of what he represented. People who came to welcome him, people who came to protest him, journalists, cameras. He gave interviews. He walked through a Warsaw he recognized and did not recognize simultaneously. The Wola district where he had been born in 1930 had been rebuilt from the rubble of 1944. The streets he had walked to work in the 1960s and 1970s were overlaid with the commercial presence of a post-communist economy, and the General Staff Building, where he had spent 9 years photographing classified documents, still stood, housing a military that was now in the process of seeking membership in the alliance against which those documents had been directed. The city he had not seen since 1981 had been transformed by the same political changes that had transformed his own official status from condemned traitor to controversial subject of public commemoration. He spoke about his decisions in the careful, measured way of a man who had spent many years thinking about what to say if ever given the chance. He said that he had acted for Poland. He said that what the Soviet war plans had revealed, that Polish cities were acceptable nuclear casualties in Soviet military strategy, had made the question of loyalty clear to him, and that loyalty to the Polish people had required acting against the system that served Soviet interests at Polish expense. He did not present himself as having made an easy decision, or as being entirely certain that every specific act had been the right one. He presented himself as a man who had seen something that required a response and had responded in the only way available to him. He said relatively little about his sons in public, and what he did say was brief and careful. The speech of a person speaking about a grief that has not diminished and that cannot be made presentable for an interview. He declined to speculate publicly about the circumstances of their deaths. He said that he missed them in a way that had not changed and that he did not expect it to change. In the period following his return, President Alexander Kwaśniewski, a former communist who had become one of Poland's senior political figures in the post-1989 era, formally recognized Kukliński's contribution to Polish national security, describing him, after Poland's accession to NATO in March 1999, as the first Polish officer to serve in NATO, a formulation that reframed 9 years of secret espionage as a form of alliance service rather than unilateral betrayal. Critics pointed out that this framing sanitized genuine complexity by assimilating his actions to a post hoc institutional framework. Kukliński had not made contact with the CIA because Poland was a NATO member. He had done so in a context where Poland was formally aligned with the Soviet Union and where his actions were, by any reading of the legal framework he operated within, illegal and punishable by death. The argument that he had effectively served NATO interests was retrospectively true, but was not the framework within which he had made his decisions. Streets in Polish cities were named for him. Schools took his name. The Polish military began a formal internal reassessment of his case that would eventually result in the posthumous restoration of his rank and honors, a recognition that the institution he had served against had, by a different name and a different command structure, come to see his work as service rather than betrayal. He continued to give interviews in the years after 1997, though his health declined as the decade turned into the early 2000s and he spent most of his remaining years at his home in Florida, following Polish news at a distance and giving occasional extended interviews to researchers who sought him out. He had by this point outlived both of his sons, and the accounts he gave in those years carried the particular quality of a person who has moved past the phase of justifying himself and into something more searching. Researchers who visited him in that period found a man who spoke about his work with a measured precision that had not changed, the same methodical intelligence officer's habit of describing events in their correct sequence and attributing claims accurately, but who spoke about his family with a grief that was still present, and that he did not attempt to manage for the interview. The accounts he gave of his motivations remained consistent with what he had said in the immediate aftermath of his defection. He had acted for Poland, he had acted against a system he believed threatened Poland, and he had accepted the costs of that action as the only ones available to a man in his position. He was asked, in a 2002 interview, whether history had vindicated him. He answered carefully. He said that the Poland of 2002 was not the Poland he had feared when reviewing Soviet nuclear war plans in the early 1970s. He said that he did not know whether anything he had done had contributed to that difference, and that he was not sure it was possible to know. Ryszard Kukliński died on February 11, 2004, in Tampa, Florida. He was 73 years old. He had outlived both of his sons. He had outlived the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, and the political system whose secrets he had spent 9 years photographing. He had lived long enough to see his homeland become a member of NATO and the European Union, political transformations that would have been inconceivable to the men on both sides of his double life when he passed that sealed letter to an American officer in the Netherlands in the summer of 1972. His death was announced in Poland with a level of public attention that reflected both the genuine significance of his story and the genuine unresolved nature of the debate about what it meant. Obituaries described him variously as a hero, a patriot, a controversial figure, and a traitor, all four characterizations appearing in the Polish press in the days following his death, sometimes in the same publication, applied simultaneously by writers who could not settle on a single frame for what he had done and what it had cost. In the United States, the CIA publicly acknowledged his contribution in terms that had not been available while he was alive. Statements from current and former officials confirming that his intelligence had been of extraordinary value and that the agency's debt to him was genuine. These statements were gracious. They did not resolve anything, because the debt they acknowledged was not the kind that can be settled. Hanka Kukliński, who survived her husband, declined to give major interviews in the period following his death. She was elderly and in declining health. The family that had once been 4 people, 2 parents, 2 sons, a life built in Warsaw over 2 decades, had been reduced, through the events of 30 years, to one person managing a grief shaped by everything that had happened and by the particular texture of a life lived, for more than 2 decades, in the margins of official history. The 35,000 pages that Ryszard Kukliński photographed and passed to the CIA over 9 years, the war plans, the nuclear employment documents, the targeting lists, the operational annexes, are artifacts of a strategic environment that no longer exists. The Warsaw Pact disbanded in 1991. The countries whose military forces those plans coordinated are now, most of them members of the NATO alliance, those plans were designed to defeat. The scenarios they anticipated, a Warsaw Pact armored offensive westward through Germany, a nuclear exchange in Central Europe, did not occur. Whether Kukliński's intelligence contributed to that outcome is a question the historical record cannot definitively answer. Intelligence operations do not leave clean causal trails. The decisions that shape history are made by institutions and individuals responding to many inputs simultaneously, and tracing any particular input to any particular outcome is, outside of carefully documented specific cases, generally impossible. What can be said is that the scenario he feared when he passed his letter to an American officer in the Netherlands in August 1972, Polish cities destroyed in a nuclear exchange planned in Moscow, Poland sacrificed as a geographic convenience in a war whose objectives were defined by Soviet strategic priorities, didn't happen. The system whose secrets he spent 9 years exposing collapsed not through military conflict, but through the accumulated weight of its own failures and contradictions, and through the persistence of millions of ordinary people, including the 9 million Poles who joined Solidarity in 1980 and whose movement Kukliński had helped, by passing its martial law plans to the CIA, to partially protect against surprise. The human cost of what Kukliński did was paid most heavily by people who had no agency in his decisions. His sons, who were children when he made his first contact with the CIA, and young men when they crossed into West Germany in the middle of November 1981, paid it with deaths that came too early and under circumstances that were never fully explained. His wife paid it with decades of displacement, living in a country that was not her country under a name that was not her name, watching her husband be celebrated and condemned simultaneously by the country she had left behind. Kukliński himself paid it with the particular loneliness of a man who cannot be honest about who he is or what he has done, who must maintain a false surface through every ordinary interaction, who knows that the work he considers most significant in his life is work that cannot be discussed. The Polish officers who worked alongside Kukliński in the General Staff Building in Warsaw during those 9 years, who ate lunch with him, who reviewed the same planning documents, who discussed the same strategic problems, who trusted him with the natural trust of professional colleagues who have worked together for years, never knew that the man they worked beside was photographing those documents and passing them to an adversary. Some of those officers may have faced additional scrutiny from the SB when Kukliński's defection became public, as counterintelligence attempted to determine whether others in the division had been involved. What it meant for those men to learn, after the fact, that the colleague they had trusted had been engaged for 9 years in something they had no knowledge of, that is a dimension of the story that left no formal record and that belongs entirely to the people who lived it. Their experience of discovering that a trusted colleague had been, throughout the entirety of their professional relationship, someone entirely different from who they believed him to be, is a version of what Hanka Kukliński experienced in a West German safe house in November 1981 and what his sons experienced as they grew old enough to understand the full picture of their father's Warsaw years. The revelation that the person you have trusted was, in some essential dimension, not fully present, that is a form of loss that does not require a death to produce grief. Ryszard Kukliński was 42 years old when he passed a sealed letter to an American military officer in the Netherlands and changed everything. He was 73 when he died in Tampa, Florida, in the country he had served at the cost of everything the life he had built in Poland had contained. And in between, he watched the world for which he had taken that risk dissolve in ways he could not have predicted when he was sitting in his Warsaw office, reviewing documents that showed him, with the clarity of classified military planning, exactly how expendable his country was considered to be by the alliance that claimed to be its protector. He said, near the end of his life, that there were things he had done and things that had happened to his family that he could not fully make sense of, and that he was not sure sense-making of that kind belonged to the person who had lived it, rather than to the people who came after. What the record does contain is the story of a man who believed he knew the answer, who acted on that belief at a cost he could not have fully anticipated, and who lived long enough to see the system whose plans he had exposed become history. Whether that was enough, whether it was the right kind of enough, in the right way, for the right reasons, is the question he carried with him until he died, and the one that nobody who came after him has been able to answer in his place.